So tonight, let's see here. I've heard about Stan for a fair amount of time now as a presenter of the Civil War. And we've done some emails and we finally got connected and got a time. And I particularly picked November because I wanted to do something to honor all the veterans. Now, granted, he's living way beyond his life when he'd be 175, but we're going to pretend tonight. And Dr. Stanley Sibley is a retired history and government teacher. He is from Glenwood, and it is delightful to have him here tonight. And I'm going to turn the program over to him. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for coming out tonight. Marla's explained that I am an old history nerd, and years ago I did my first reenactment, and it was at Fort Laramie out in Wyoming. Fort Laramie is a historic site, and so while we were doing our reenacting, we frequently had tourists stopping by, sometimes whole buses. We were out there doing the 19th century infantry guys, and we were told that before going out there, we had to have a 19th century, am I too loud? We needed to have a 19th century persona. That is to say, why are we there in 1876, and what are we doing? But we were told that if tourists came by and asked us, and we answered in 19th century, but they said, no, who are you? What are you doing here? Don't get them angry. Just take your hat off, put it under your arm, and then you are once again in, it was 20th century then, now 21st. So that's what I'll do tonight. If I want to slip out of character, you'll know it because I won't be covered. Good evening, everyone. My name is John Y. Stone. The initial Y stands for Young, which was my maternal grandfather's first name, and it was the name by which I was known as a boy. I was born in April 23rd of 1843 in Sangamon County in Illinois. Our family farm was about 9 miles north of Springfield and real close, just a stone's throw away from the city of Athens. I had two younger sisters. Elizabeth, we called Betty, and Nancy, we called Nanny. We went to the city schools over in Athens, and we were encouraged in our studies by our parents, but also by grandfather, Spencer Stone. Grandfather decided he was going to leave Illinois in 1853. I was just 10 years old, and he struck west, going in search of more and cheaper land, which he found in southwest Iowa along the banks of Silver Creek, probably 20 miles as the crow flies from here southeast. 1856, however, when I was 13, turned out to be a really difficult year for us. In February of that year, our beloved mother passed away. News traveled slowly in those days, but as soon as grandfather heard the news, he came back straight away with a covered wagon and a fine team of horses and a big idea that we should go with him back to his land in Iowa. Father couldn't leave just then. He had a crop in the field. He was a cooper, and he had contracts to fill. And so we left him behind, with the girls and I eagerly put our meager belongings in the wagon, and off we went for Iowa. We traveled, it was a great adventure. We traveled across western Illinois. We crossed the wide Mississippi River on a ferry boat near Fort Madison. And from there to here, we traveled pretty well traveled trails and roads that had first been blazed by the Mormons on their flight from Nauvoo, Illinois, and in their search for their new Zion, which was at the short term here in Council Bluffs, long-term, of course, for the West. Father joined us early the next year. And he soon fell in love again and married once again in the late year of 1857. At that point, his new wife was a lovely woman. She took care of Elizabeth and Nanny and I just as carefully as she would her own children that she later had with our father. We went to country school near our farmhouse, and we were very fortunate to have a very excellent teacher, very well educated. He was very engaging, and he made all of the subjects fun. Furthermore, he supplemented our 3 R's curriculum with other lessons in such things as algebra, calculus, Latin. I really enjoyed school. I did quite well. I especially liked anything that had competition with it. I gained kind of a reputation for being the best speller on Silver Creek and for miles around. In fact, I'll brag a little bit. Several years later, when the spelling bee craze hit Glenwood, I unhorsed all competitors for miles around except for one person, SV Proudfit, who was my own law partner at the time. But if you knew Vic Proudfit what I do, you would know that coming in second to him in any kind of competition was really no small task. I went to high school in Glenwood, and by the time I finished high school, I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I gained the friendship of William Hale, who was a lawyer there in town, and with his assistance, I was able to procure a copy of Walker's American Law, which was a fairly well-known textbook of the day. But when I finished high school in the spring of 1861, going into law or anything else was out of question. War clouds were on the horizon. Several southern states had already seceded from the Union. Shots had been fired at Fort Sumter, and President Lincoln had put out a request for 75,000 volunteers in order to put down this rebellion. I was 18 years old. I could not wait to be involved. It turned out that a company was going to be formed, a company of infantry was going to be formed right there in Glenwood that fall in October. And I spent every waking moment that summer and early fall trying to learn everything I could about military life, marching, drills, regulations, and the rest. By the time October 10th came around, and I finally was able to enlist, I was enlisted as 4th Corporal in our company. It turned out it was going to be Company F, and we would be assigned to the 15th Volunteer Infantry later on. Within a few months after joining, all 100 officers and men were loaded into wagons, horse-drawn wagons. We made it as far as Eddyville, and then we were able to get on the railroad. Another real adventure, first time I had ridden the rails. And we took the rails then to Keokuk, where the regiment, in fact, many regiments were being formed. Our officers at the time were Edwin Blackmar, who was a Glenwood man, and our second in command was a lawyer from Sydney. His name was James G. Day. Well, as soon as we got to Keokuk and started to learn the ways of the Army, Captain or Lieutenant Day was promoted to captain and given command of Company I, which was also being formed by right there with us. During the 4 months that we were in Keokuk, we learned everything about the military. We learned marching, maneuvering, getting around the battlefield. We learned discipline. We learned Army regulations. And during that time period, we were issued our uniforms and all forms of the equipment that we would need. Our haversacks and our canteens, shelter halves, everything else, learned how they all work. One thing that we didn't get while we were there, well, there were two things: our arms and our ammunition. So we took off on a cold, drizzling morning in March, and we were marched down to the river and boarded steamboats on our way to the front. But we weren't alone. We were in the presence of thousands of our fellow Iowans who had come out that morning braving the cold and rainy weather in their Sunday best. It was heartwarming for all of us to see our fellow citizens out there waving banners and flags, hankies from every rooftop, from every window, shouting, "God bless you, Godspeed." It was a very moving experience. We went as far as St. Louis, actually Benton Barracks in St. Louis, where we finally were issued our arms. They were Springfield 61 muskets, very much like this one. But still, no ammunition. We were loaded back on boats, headed back down the Mississippi, and then down the Mississippi, we went up the Ohio, and then up to Tennessee. We were actually headed towards a place called Corinth in Mississippi. It's the northern part of Mississippi. But we didn't go all the way there. We went to a place called Pittsburgh Landing, which is about 20 miles north of where we were really headed. But let me tell you why. The city of Corinth had a network of railroads there. And railroads and other forms of transportation were absolutely critical to the South. And the strategy of the Union was to disrupt as many of those areas that we possibly could. General Grant was at Pittsburgh Landing, and he was forming an army in order to attack Corinth. Corinth was very well defended. They had heavy fortifications, and there was a fairly good-sized army there, actually led by Albert Sidney Johnston, one of those famous generals of the South, at least at first, and P.T. Beauregard, who you may have heard of. Those two generals decided that they weren't going to wait around while Grant was reinforcing his army there. And so we all had a surprise waiting for us. On April 6th, in the wee hours of the morning, as we were pulling into Pittsburgh Landing, we could already hear the rattle of muskets and the booming of cannons. Turned out the Confederates didn't want to wait until Grant had formed his larger army and went ahead and did a preemptive attack. As we were unloading from the boats, pandemonium was breaking loose. The Federals were totally surprised and took to flight. We were hustled off the boats, given our ammunition, put into ranks, and marched into war. That day was pandemonium, as I said. Men were getting separated from their units. Horses were running wild. Wagons were driverless and with teams running through the battlefield. and it looked like sheer chaos. But we were successful that day in finally getting ourselves organized. And towards the end of the day, although we had all been pushed back towards the banks of the river itself, those of us who were there received compliments from our officers for the way we held our cool and followed orders during that day. Things were going to improve overnight, however. We were to be reinforced by a large army coming from further north. It was General Don Carlos Buell and his Army of the Cumberland. 20 or 30,000 men showed up overnight, which gave us the power, the numbers that we needed, and the time to get organized in order to push the Confederates away. The Confederates had enough, and although they had their way with us all day on the 6th, on the 7th, they moved back to Corinth. Now, you probably have never heard of Pittsburgh Landing, but the battle I'm sure you have learned of. It was the bloodiest day in American history up until that day. The battle was named for a little church that sat on that ground of Shiloh. Mm-hmm. The Battle of Shiloh was our baptism in blood and fire. At the beginning of that day, of course, we were raw recruits, but we felt like veterans the next day. Over the course of the next 3 or 4 weeks, several important things happened. One of them was Corinth fell to our troops. So the first major strategic battle that I was in proved to be successful. The railroad lines at Corinth and all that represented to the south fell into the Union hands. Another thing that happened at about that same time was the 11th, the 13th, the 15th, and the 16th regiments. Each regiment has about 1,000 men and officers. Those regiments all had marched together on the 6th, and we were formed into a brigade. And we fought together for the entire rest of the war. The brigade was known in history as Crocker's Brigade, and it was named for our very first commanding officer, Marcellus Crocker, who was, although he'd been a civilian, just had a natural flair military. At one point, General Grant said that he was among the finest division leaders that he had had in any of the armies that he had commanded. The other kind of important thing in my life, at least, was that I was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant. Some of you have seen some of these things we have up here. One of the accoutrements that I would have received, other than officers' bars, would have been a saber. Now, it wasn't that we were swashbucklers, and it wasn't that we got in sword fights, but the key for a lieutenant leading a platoon was to always be able to be visible to his men. And if you take that out and raise it, it tells your men exactly where you are. And if they're not rallying around the flag, they should come and rally around that blade. Following our victory at Corinth, the next important place on our agenda was Vicksburg. Vicksburg was a fortress. It stood on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, about halfway down its length, on high bluffs. It was heavily armed with an air army, and it furthermore had cannons strategically placed up and down its banks in order to get any of the ships that were boats that were coming down the river. It was important in our strategy in the Civil War to divide the Confederacy up. The first issue in the grand scheme of things was to constrain the Confederacy where it was after the initial 11 states seceded. It was important that the border states not secede. And so the first skirmishes in the Civil War were in places like Missouri and Kentucky. It was to keep those places from turning coat and joining their slaveholding partners to the south. But another part of that major strategy was to divide it up by taking the river that would slice the whole western part of the Confederacy off and would further the grand strategy. The problem was Vicksburg was so heavily armed that it took months in order to get close to it. There was no way a frontal attack could be made successfully. But what we could do was to siege and starve them out. The siege went for months. It was a horrible thing for the civilians that were captured or were caught there in Vicksburg. Much starvation. They were eating rats. They were out of their homes. We were able to lob shells in every day. Finally, after an extended siege, they finally surrendered. It was July 4th, 1863. Some of you know what happened on July 3rd of 1863. That was the day that Meade's army of the Potomac defeated Lee's army of North Virginia at a low place in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. These two victories in 1 week brought jubilation to everybody around the North. And we were sure that people around the North were sure that with those two victories, the war could not go much longer. Yet those of us in ranks, we knew about not only the valor, but the tenacity of our Southern foe. And we doubted that there would be peace anytime soon. Everybody knows about the battles. And they were important strategically and for victory. But for those of us in ranks, battle was really took up least of our time. Most of our time was in marching and in camp and doing mundane jobs. It was not always that you were engaged in a life and death excitement. Just a few words about life in an Army camp. When you go into camp, there were reasons for it. You needed reinforcements, you needed to reorganize, you needed to resupply. You needed to train new recruits that were coming in to replace those who were lost. And a lot of it, of course, was just tied into really mundane chores. Chopping firewood, cleaning out latrines, hauling water. And the most important mundane job that we all had was taking care of the horses and the mules. At one point, General Sherman had a standing order on the march to the sea. The standing order was for every man at the end of the day's march. Their first job was to take care of the horses and the mules. And the way the order read, take care of the horses and mules on which everything depends. Everything an army did in the 19th century, they did only with the help of animal power. But we were all young men, and we were full of energy, and we liked to have fun, even though this was wartime. And there was lots of things to do at camp. We would, there were sports, horse racing, especially steeplechasing, foot racing, wrestling, an early version of the game of baseball. You wouldn't recognize it if you saw it. But also table games, dominoes, chess, checkers, all kinds of playing cards. Some men carried musical instruments around. In fact, nearly every regiment had a band, because you had an opportunity for a certain amount of recreation. For myself, I still enjoy reading. I taught myself how to read French. I could never speak it, but I taught myself to read French for one main reason. I wanted to read the books of a man by the name of Antoine-Henri Jomini. Jomini was a Swiss militarist who was a aide to General Napoleon. He went with Napoleon on most of his battles. And he carefully documented Napoleon's military philosophies, strategies, tactics, logistics, and so forth. His books became very well read around the world by people who studied warfare. In fact, those books became kind of the hallmark, the cornerstone of the curriculum at the U.S. Naval, or the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. So, in January of 1864, I took a furlough and I went home back to Glenwood. At that point, I met a young man in town who I hadn't known before. His name was P.T. Ballard. He was a new person in town. And he had a lot of newsprint with him. And he was thinking about forming a newspaper right there in Glenwood. I'd never considered such a thing. But the more I talked with him, the more intrigued I got. But I couldn't spend very much time thinking about that because I was back at the front. On my way back to my unit, I went by way of St. Louis. And I was kind of feeling good about myself, an officer. I was making something of myself. And so I thought I'd splurge. I made a huge investment, my first really big expenditure. When I stopped in St. Louis, I bought a very fine officer's greatcoat. It cost me $60.
Ooh.
Believe it. It was a princely color. But I knew that that coat would be very helpful, not only in the winter coming, but also in all of those winters to come in Iowa. When I got back to the front, it had moved to Georgia. And the target was Atlanta. Now, Atlanta was critical. Probably the second most strategic place in all of the South. You might wonder why, but it was a railroad hub, it was a transportation center, it was a industrial center. They made everything there from cannons and ordnance to shoes. And it was a warehouse of food for the Confederacy. So it was very, very strategic. So when I got back, I had another assignment given to me. While we were at Vicksburg, I oftentimes would serve temporarily as the adjutant for my regiment, 15th Regiment. But when I got back, I received a promotion to first lieutenant, and I was given the task of being the aide-de-camp to the brigade headquarters. Now, what that meant was that I would be a key person in the leadership scheme of things in communication. Being the aide-de-camp was an exacting job. It was an essential job, and it was a very dangerous job because it was the job of going from one commander to another commander and making sure that everybody was on the same page. The job of making it work. The job of the aide-de-camp was dangerous, but it was also exciting. It did put me in the forefront of the action. And I would like to, if you don't mind, tell a few of my experiences in that role. On July 20th of 1864, the two armies were in very, very close proximity on opposite sides of the Chattahoochee River. On the 20th, our entire corps was engaged in action across the river. Our brigade was given the assignment of protecting Hooker's flank. Hooker was a division leader within our corps, and he was taking the lead that day in aggressiveness. Our task was to take the brigade and to put pressure on the enemy's flank, which would keep the enemy from being able to receive reinforcements. Unfortunately, as they were marching through very thick timber, one of our regiments got separated from the rest. That created a gap in our line. And if you know anything about military strategy, a gap in the line can very easily be exploited by the enemy. I knew that I had to get to that other regiment. They were on a ridge about 200 yards away. And if I could just get there, I could correct that situation. The problem was that ridge was across a narrow little valley, about 200 yards across. And on the far end of that valley was an entire regiment of Confederate riflemen. I didn't have time to go around. And so I spurred my horse into a gallop. I leaned low over his neck, and I made my way as fast as I could across that opening. As soon as I became visible, the air was just simply full of bullets. Somehow I made it to the ridge, and just before going over the ridge, I raised my hat and I waved it at the Confederates in my rear. I didn't know what happened, but the next moment there was an explosion of cheering and huzzas. And it finally dawned on me, they were cheering me. And I thought, what a strange thing is war. That one moment, men will try their darndest to kill someone, and a moment later, cheer is derring do in the success. 2 days later, on the same day that our heroic and beloved corps leader, General James McPherson, was killed. Again, all of the corps of our army were standing shoulder to shoulder, and the 17th, which was our corps, received some of the most critical fighting. In fact, in our brigade, we were in hand-to-hand fighting for quite some time. In fact, at one point, the Confederates, it was back and forth so much. At one point, the Confederates had taken over our command post, our command headquarters. It was only for a few minutes. We were able to push them back, but the fighting continued. Later that day, Colonel Hall, our brigade commander, sought me out, asked me to take a horse and go to the rear. Find an ammunition wagon, bring it forward as soon as possible, and hand it over to a unit that was running dangerously low. I did that. I got to the rear, found a wagon, and we started back. But on our way back, we were jumped by a squadron of Confederate cavalry. For several hundred yards, a running gun battle pursued. Finally, we got close enough to our lines that our infantry put enough fire out there on the pursuing Confederates that they gave up chase. Once I got back inside our lines, safe and sound, I saw that my gallant mount had been shot, had been wounded. A bullet had come in his side, in front of his flank, kind of behind where my leg was, and it exited out the other side. Once he got me back inside my lines safely, the poor beast shuddered, went to his knees, and died. He was just one of over 1 million equines, horses, and mules who lost their lives during the Civil War. At the end of the day, Colonel Hall's report to headquarters announced that we had lost 600 men. But he also, very nicely, gave me a lot of credit and complimented my efforts and my courage and my conduct, for which I am grateful. Before all this happened, Colonel Hall, on his way back from furlough one time, had stopped in St. Louis and had bought a very fine bottle of champagne. And he kept it in his bag, and he told us that the reason he had it was when Atlanta fell, those of us on his staff were going to celebrate the fact by drinking that bottle of champagne. Well, the next day, the flag of truce came across from the Arkansas Brigade that was facing us. The flag of truce came in. What they wanted to do was to have a short truce so that they could come over and get their dead that was within our lines. It was a common request. It was agreed to immediately. I was assigned to go and be one of the officers who just kind of, watched it to make sure that everything was going according to plan. I fell into conversation with a brigadier general from the Arkansas Brigade that had faced us and had treated us so badly the day before. His name was General Daniel Govan. And as we were visiting, he said, yesterday, our troops captured one of a Union headquarters. In fact, we liberated a fine bottle of champagne. And I said to him, General, Colonel Hall purchased that for the express purpose of being able to celebrate with his staff on the day that Atlanta fell. General Govan, with a wink and a smile, said, please give your colonel my compliments and my sincerest apologies. But I won't be able to return that bottle because we've had a little celebration of our own. When I got back to camp, I discovered that that bottle of champagne wasn't the only spoils of war. Remember that $60 overcoat?
Mm-hmm. Aww.
General Govan and his men apparently liberated that one as well. When Atlanta fell, finally, I was able to cast my very first ballot. I had turned 21 in April, and I cast my ballot very proudly for Abraham Lincoln for a second term. It was my first official act, political act, but it wouldn't be my last. I would be a lifelong Republican, an active Republican in Republican politics, and I would be a public servant for most of the rest of my life. my enlistment was due to come up on October 10th. But I voluntarily extended my enlistment until the March to the Sea to find its conclusion. Finally, in the latter part of December of 1864, I took my, as soon as Savannah fell, I took my discharge and I returned home. Pardon me. Back home in Glenwood, I renewed my acquaintance with P.T. Ballard. In fact, I bought a share in his new project, which was the newspaper that he called Our Opinion. And I also accepted his offer to become the editor. The other thing that happened to me that very shortly, I also accepted the offer of William Hale to accept a position as clerk in his law office. Now, in those days, if you wanted to be a lawyer, you could go to law school, but another perfectly good way or pathway was to work for, apprentice, if you would, with a lawyer, work in the office, help do the research on various cases, reading the law, the facts of the case, and judicial decisions, until you finally got a handle on how the judicial system worked. At the end of that apprentice, if you were recommended by the lawyer you were working with, you would then be able to take an examination for a panel or a single judge. And if you passed, you could be entered to the bar. Well, 1867 was a red letter day for me. The first thing that happened was William Hale, my colleague in the law office, recommended my application for membership in the bar. I passed a rigorous exam by District Judge James G. Day. He had been our commander in the second command. In fact, at Shiloh, he had been wounded and I helped him off the field. And he was the man who was the final arbiter on my application. I passed that exam and became a lawyer. The second thing that happened in 1867 that was so special was I ran for and was elected to the State House of Representatives. And the third and probably the most important thing that happened in that year was I wooed Miss Harriet Solomon, a high school friend and more, and convinced her to marry me. We married on January 1st of 1868, and on that very day, we disembarked and took off for Des Moines, where I would take my seat as the youngest member of the Iowa legislature. I would serve in the legislature for 8 years, the first 4 years in the House, the middle 4 years in the Senate, and then the last 4 years, I went back to the House. I was involved in many political and legislative battles, many to recount here. But among my leadership positions was judiciary chair, and my last year serving, I was Speaker of the House. I was involved in several legislative issues, one that might have some local interest to people today. I was the chief sponsor and champion for a bill to create what we called in the 19th century the Institution for Feeble-Minded Children. The issue boiled down to the treatment of people who had mental disorders, mental illness. They had been locked up and placed in almost in jails. But there was reform going, and that reform was now they needed treatment, not punishment. And so the institution that I proposed, or was a champion for, would help that cause. The bill passed in the House of Representatives easily, but it got bogged down in the Senate, and it failed by 3 votes. I had served in the Senate. I had friends there. I went to them and pled my case, in the case of these children. One of them agreed to make a motion to reconsider, since he'd been on the dominant side. That motion passed, and when the bill was taken up again, it also passed. It was a very proud moment for us, and also for Glenwood, which became the home of that institution, and still is today. After 1980, I left the legislature and decided to go home once again to my family and to my law practice. I went back into practice with a man by the name of Mr. Shirley DeLilland and his partner, Victor Proudhead, who I talked about earlier, the spelling champion. And I served as, went into law with the 2 of them and served in that office. I also dabbled in agriculture. I started buying land on the west side of Glenwood and planting apple trees in a vineyard, a great vineyard. But I also spent time with my family. Harriet and I had 4 children, but to our sorrow, 3 of them had died in infancy. Our son Clarence, who was born in 1871, I was serving in the legislature. However, he grew to a manhood and became a very fine young man, and made us very proud. In 1894, he married a woman by the name of Jessie Flashman, who was the daughter of one of the first families of Mills County, and they honored us and blessed us with 4 grandchildren. Also in the 80s, we built a very fine house, beautiful house, on the corner of 3rd and Chestnut, which would be our home. But in 1888, I could not resist another final call to public service. I was approached to and urged to run for the position of Attorney General of the state of Iowa. With my love of law and my love of politics, I could not resist. I ran and I was elected. I was reelected in 1890 and reelected again in 1892. I became the first man in Iowa to serve 3 terms as Attorney General. After I left that office, I was often called General Stone. Now, when you hear me referred to as General Stone, you'll know I only got to be a first lieutenant, but that general is a reference to having been Attorney General. As Attorney General, a number of things were hot on the calendar, too many to go into in any depth, except railroad, some railroad issues. I should be very careful here because I know some of the members of this audience have very deep railroad ties. But the railroad prices that they were, the fees, became a very difficult problem a railroad commission was established, which would work with the railroads and rectify those problems. Unfortunately, the railroads didn't want to work with the commission, and they sent a bevy of lawyers to sue, and I had to stand against them. Fortunately, I prevailed after it went to the Supreme Court of the United States, and the commissions were indeed allowed to set rates in Iowa. And I'd like to apologize to whoever is approved. I shouldn't have said that too. At any rate, towards the end of my term as Attorney General, I did accept another commission from the legislature. They had an issue that they really wanted to deal with, and that was the recodification of Iowa's laws. They asked if I would stay on and head that commission, which I was glad to do. The laws in Iowa have been recodified since statehood. And you can only imagine all of the niggling little issues that would be differences in one section to another section. That all had to be worked out. And before I left Des Moines, I did work with that commission, and we did bring in a recodified set of laws. When I returned to Glenwood after that, I returned more as a senior statesman than an active politician. I still stayed active in Republican politics, of course, but in addition, I stayed very close to my old comrades in the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. It was a brotherhood. We had all served, if not together, at least in similar posts. The GAR, incidentally, was the predecessor of what we know today as the American Legion. And this month of November, I guess it's particularly pertinent that we should talk about that particular relationship of soldiers from different centuries, different wars. I also stayed a member of the Masonic Lodge, the Masonic Order, and I kept my membership, a long-time membership, in the Baptist Church. We had some reversals of fortune. The pine orchard and vineyard that I had hoped for suffered with freezes and blight, and I lost significant fortune. During that period of time, we sold our fine house on Chestnut Street and moved to smaller quarters, into a smaller house. I lost my dear wife, Patty, to Bright's disease in 1903, and our son, Clarence, died suddenly in 1919. After, I should step back and say, still back in the 90s, I did go into one last practice of law. I met a young man in Council Bluffs by the name of Lieutenant Tinley. He was the son of Irish immigrants, and he was brilliant. He had set up a law practice, and then he asked if I would join it. I was glad to. I joined as senior partner. That firm started as Stone Tinley, and it's just a few blocks from here now as Stewart Tinley. I'm happy they left the first two letters of my name on business. At any rate, after my dear son passed away, his widow, my daughter-in-law, Jessie, who I love, came and lived with me in my small house there on Vine Street. We crafted an apartment of sorts in that house where I could live, read my books, and not bother her. she could have the rest of the house and entertain her friends and her family. She became my companion and oftentimes my caregiver for the rest of my life. John Stone passed away a few blocks from here at Jesse Edmondson Hospital after an extended series of ailments and illnesses. Passed away on June the 26th of 1928 at the age of 85 years, 2 months, and 3 days. May he rest in peace, and may his memories live on. Thank you very much.
Are there questions? Are there questions?
Answer any questions that you might have. Does anybody in the room know where John Stone's house was? Anyone? Yes. There are a few. And any questions? I could have gone on for an hour.
I've got to say,
If you don't have a question, I just might.
I've got to say that I've seen probably 3 of his presentations. I've been with him on numerous historical events, from Shiloh to the banks of the Little Bighorn. And this man is brilliant. He has a grasp of history, a desire to share history, and he's a world of fun. Now, that champagne he talked about, we carry on that tradition with a little something else. Okay.
Thank you, stranger.
Yes, sir. But that railroad part,
Yeah, Bill.
we'll have to have a backroom session about that.
Yes, indeed. Bill and Marty are dear friends, and Bill has long been involved in reenactments for many, many years longer than they. He owns the horses and the cannons and the limbers that you sometimes see at parades around here. It's my pleasure to work along with both him and Marty. Yes, Tim.
Could you speak to the research you did, where you think you found the state house or diaries, particularly some of the personal stories? Where did you get the information?
I found this stuff. Well, there's another introduction. Jackie Harless, sitting right there. She's the one person around here who knows a lot more about John Stone than I do. She works at the public library in Glenwood, and is the libraries in this state are a treasure, a storehouse of information, and they really need to be utilized more. And it's people like these people who can access all of that information. My story with John Stone, however, goes back a few years. I'd heard about cemetery walks, had attended one, talked to some of my friends in Glenwood about how cool that was. What a neat way of being able to change cemeteries from being either a scary place that you whistle past at night, or a place where you go on Memorial Day, or a place to jog or walk the dog. They are a marvelous storehouse of history. Upshot of that was, a few years later, we did a cemetery walk in Glenwood. They know, most of the people, many of my friends there know that I'm a reenactor and have a Civil War uniform. Bingo, that was it. And so I was given the obituary for John Stone and asked if I would portray him at that cemetery walk. The more I learned about him, the more I could not forget about him. He was such an incredibly powerful man, a good man, a decent man. His colleagues all loved him. He was a class act. And yet in Glenwood today, and very few people know the name or remember the name of John Y. Stone. In fact, I have a personal ambition to name one particular block in our town, John Y. Stone Boulevard. This is that memory can stay alive. I think it really needs to be. But anyway, back to the library. Back in the day, especially in the 19th century, early 20th century, people really cared about knowing about the families in their community. And they would send out questionnaires. And then they would write these stories about it. And there are these big fat books like this. And you can open it up and go right through the alphabet of the various families, their background, what they did for a living, their children, and all of those sorts of things. So those, in every one of those anecdotes that I was able to find, I found either in places like my own public library, or I recently bought this book. It was written by William Worth Belknap. Belknap was an Iowan. He led the 15th Regiment as a colonel. He went on and led, I believe, the division that they were part of, became a major general toward the latter part of his life. He also served as Secretary of War. General Belknap in 1888 wrote a letter to John Y. Stone, and he repeated some of these anecdotes that are still alive today, thanks to those written records. So, didn't make a thing of those. Thank you for that question, Tim. Other questions? Or what other questions do you have? As the teacher would say. I know you have them out there. Well, I'll stay around. There are a few things up here. There are a couple of them that are originals, and the rest of them are just simply reenactment sorts of things. But it's been my pleasure to bring the life of John Stone to you, and appreciate all of your attendance. Thank you very much.
Thank you.